This is the Anthropology podcast, hosted by me, Gabby LaPera. Every 2 weeks, I interview a biological anthropologist about what makes us, us. Hey there, everyone. It's Gabby LaPera, and you're listening to another episode of the Anthropology podcast. This time on the show, I'm interviewing Dr. Cynthia Wilczak of San Francisco State University, and it's a pretty interesting show. Dr. Wilczak actually studies functional adaptations of the skeleton or occupational stress markers, which is basically trying to determine from our skeleton what our regular activity patterns were like during life. So basically trying to figure out what job did you have, or what hobbies did you have, or what did you do repeatedly, and how did those leave marks on your skeleton? And this might sound easy, but there's actually a lot of other things that can confound this analysis. For example, age-related changes, or pathology, or even just the genetic structure of your bones. The other thing that we talk a lot about in this episode is math. Both Dr. Wilczak and I are very, very excited about math. Dr. Wilczak even says multivariate analysis, it's where it's at one point. And honestly, that gives me life. The other reason you might want to listen to this episode is that Dr. Wilczak gives a pretty long list of interesting alternatives for anthropology majors besides just going into academia. So if you're an undergraduate, this episode is probably pretty clutch. As usual, any of the books or articles mentioned on this podcast can be found on my website, anthropology.com. And that's it. I hope you enjoy the show. Hello, everyone. It's Gabby LaPera. You're joining me for another episode of the Anthropology podcast. I'm interviewing Dr. Wilczak from San Francisco State University here in her home today. Thank you so much for having me at your house. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself and what you do and what you study?
Yeah. I do study archaeological populations mostly and do skeletal analyses on those. And I started out in this field and I've gone back and forth looking specifically at markers of occupational stress. And then I've done a little bit of paleopathology. And sometimes, when you decide on a project and what you're going to do, it's just kind of an opportunistic thing. So you dabble a little bit here and there. But yeah, I seem to always come back to markers of occupational stress.
What is a marker of occupational stress?
Well, it can be a lot of things. It can be osteoarthritis has been used in the past. What I've done a lot of work on is the attachments of muscles to bone or entheses. But it can also be other things like tooth wear patterns, for example. And you might have chipping of the tooth that's been associated with, like seamstresses or upholsterers when they hold on to tacks with their teeth. It might be tooth wear that's related to diet. Fractures actually can also be thought of sometimes as a occupational stress marker.
So I'm just going to break down that term real quick. Occupational stress marker.
Yeah.
Occupation, that means job. And then stress marker is physical signs of that job that are left on the body. So you're trying to find signs of what a person did during their life when you don't have any evidence, any written evidence of what they did.
Yeah, theoretically, that's what you're trying to do. And even saying that term, markers of occupational stress, it's a bit dated. It kind of comes from the forensic literature. There was a Italian, he was actually a physician, but he was interested in forensic aspects of identification. And so he came up with that term of occupation markers or occupational stigmata.
That sounds way more dramatic.
I know, it does. This is the funniest one he described for me, because he's working with cadavers on autopsy. And he said if you could easily spread the legs into a split, and then also especially if they had very large calf muscles, then you had a dancer.
Okay.
But he was also looking at things like calluses and stuff. And I say that it is a dated term to use, although it's one that's kind of used to encompass all these different things still. Because as you're pointing out, what does occupation mean? And there's a lot of other activities and skeletal stresses. So a more modern term would be something like functional adaptations of the skeleton.
Sure, because when we say occupation, I mean, in 21st century America, we're thinking, I'm a software engineer, especially in San Francisco, or like maybe even like I'm a tailor and I'm holding the needles in between my teeth. But it could also be like, I'm a pastoralist and I herd sheep all day, so I'm walking around up and down hills. And that also leaves markers on your body as well.
Oh, absolutely. And in modern times, the types of work we do are also more varied. And kind of as you come from the prehistoric into the historical periods and into more modern times, the other things people do is they change occupations too throughout their lifetime, right?
Oh, definitely. I can't even tell you my list of jobs since I was 14. And then on top of that, today too, we have hobbies.
Absolutely.
I'm a horseback rider, and I know that there are some skeletal changes that you see in the bodies of horseback riders that you don't see in other people, especially related to like the lumbar region and the femur angle.
Well, that brings up another thing we've got to be careful of. The question has always been, well, not always. It started off looking at things like muscle attachment sites and, when you got robust muscle attachments.
Can you explain that real quick? Muscle attachment sites. I think just in case someone doesn't understand how the skeletal system works and why it's so fabulous for us.
Okay, so you have the muscles, and the way the muscles move your body is that they contract and pull on bone because they're attached to the bone through the tendon, and that pulling is going to generate a force and it's going to move the bone. So the question is, if you're doing something really repetitive or really hard labor, and you've got that force of the muscle that's pulling on the bone, over the span of your lifetime, is that going to cause a change? Is the attachment site on that bone going to react? Mm-hmm. And it can react theoretically through either making bone, or you also have in response to different stresses, especially if there's inflammation involved, you also might get bone breakdown at the site. So that's what we're talking about. And the term that we're using now is enthesial change, because the technical term for that attachment is an entheses.
And I think you're getting at something really important. I think people think of the skeleton as a very static object within our bodies. It's actually something that's constantly modeling and remodeling throughout our lives, responding to these stresses and even to a lack of stress. And along with aging changes, there's so many things that are affecting our skeletons. And then our skeletons are also these wonderful elements in the hormonal system, which I think people also don't think about. It's actually a very complicated system, and that's part of the reason I have this podcast.
Well, that's also the reason why I'm going to be, a little bit maybe conservative on saying, can I look at a skeleton and tell you what that person did?
That's a great question. Can you look at a skeleton and tell me what that person did? Tell me.
No, usually not. And the problem is because of what you were mentioning, that there's age-related changes, and those are actually really significant. So you have to count for that. And then you've got the hormonal changes that you mentioned. And also, the skeleton can react differently in different people just because of differences in the anatomy itself, the morphology of the bone. Because for example, you talked about the angle of the femur. Mm-hmm. Well, if you have a different angle on the femur, when you get movement and contractions of the muscle, that can change the amount of force that's actually being exerted because of the biomechanics of it.
Sure. And so when we say the angle of the femur, there's two like main angles when we talk about the femur. There's the one, your femur is kind of like a very small upside down L where the what would be the bottom part goes into your hip socket, and that's the neck of the femur. So that can be one of the angles. And then the other one is how your femur, which is your thigh bone, connects to your knee. That can be another angle. And I can't remember why I was explaining that.
Oh, because I said that can affect how much force is exerted.
Yeah, certainly, and that can be genetic, right? So
absolutely,
the angle that you originally start out with can be genetic, and then you have on top of that genetic angle whatever you're doing during your lifetime.
Exactly. And then haven't even mentioned pathology, because there are some diseases that actually can cause you to do things like form bone at entheses. And so if that's another one, if somebody has some sort of disease, they're more likely to form bone there.
Yeah.
And it becomes frustrating, right? Because you want to find out one thing from a skeleton, but getting at that data can be sometimes really, really tough.
Right. And then you also have this question of you're looking at an individual and you can maybe determine some things about this individual, but do those conclusions extend to that society at large? And like how far can that extend to?
Absolutely. And even if you look at an individual skeleton, you can look at a population of skeletons, and every time you add more complexity, more people, some of them, genetically they may be different, males versus females. Now you're adding another layer that can affect how their skeleton is reacting. And so then you have to account for that and the ages that we mentioned. And so it's great, you talk about sample sizes in science, that large sample sizes. Well, every time you add another variable, when you're trying to analyze data, you need to have larger and larger samples.
Right.
And when we're doing bioarchaeology, you're limited a lot of times by, you get what you get.
Right. And this is an issue that Dr. Wood brought up in his interview, if y'all remember, where he talks about how, especially in paleoanthropology, they have a sample size of like 1 or 2. At least in bioarchaeology, you might have like 10 from a certain site, or even more, depending on what like group you're looking at. The remains are more likely to be preserved in a historic context.
That's absolutely true. Yes. And so, yeah, if you go farther back, and when you're looking at something like the surfaces of bone too, you lose a lot. Even if, you've got the general bone, you lose some of the surface just from changes
in the environment.
In the environment. And so you can lose a lot of samples that way.
Yeah, it can be really frustrating. I still remember a time that I opened a box and the entire skeleton was full of brushite, this like crystalline structure on the bone. And everyone just kind of froze because we knew that if we bumped that box too hard, it would just start to crumble in front of us. And we were all like, we don't know what to do now.
Don't sneeze.
I know. Oh my gosh. So it can definitely be stressful. I'm guessing that one of the questions you get a lot when you say that you can determine potentially someone's occupation.
Thank you for saying
bone.
Potentially.
I know this isn't the TV show Bones, so you can't look at a set of bones.
Oh yeah, I can't even watch stuff like that.
The thing that's always baffled me about that TV show is that the skeleton, very generally, unless you have some rare mutations, it is the same every time, and yet every time they manage to like misplace an ulna or the humerus is upside down, and I'm like, you have like literally hundreds of episodes of the show. No one learned how to lay out a skeleton.
I know. Or could you have a little diagram or something?
I know. Just like, oh my God. Anyway, but still, I think that probably people are probably interested in hearing about some of the occupational stress markers and like what they denote. So you mentioned, for example, the tailors with the tailor's notches in their teeth from holding pins or tacks.
Yeah. And I can tell you about some of the speculation that's gone on about what potential tasks they might have been doing with this. But again, keeping in mind, the other problem is you might become fixated and say, well, this would be consistent with this type of activity. But, the truth is, when you think about what you do, whether it's lifting boxes or laying bricks, there's a lot of overlap in which sort of, muscles you're synergistically using. And, any movement that you have, it's not just one muscle, right? And so that is also what's going to make it difficult. But I'll give you an example of one that has been called an occupational stress marker, where it might be a little bit more limited. And that's clay shoveler's fracture, which is a fracture in the lower cervical and thoracic vertebrae, so that the bottom of your neck. And there's a little process that comes off the back.
A process means anything that sticks out.
Thank you for the translation.
You're welcome.
And that actually can fracture. And it's called the clay shoveler's fracture because it's been associated with shoveling heavy dirt. Like when they were building the Autobahn and you had to shovel a lot. Associated with, you're more likely to fracture there because as you're shoveling and clay is one form of soil that's really heavy, you're having to pick it up and go like this. And the scapula, the bone that attaches your arm that's right on your back.
Your shoulder blade.
Again, wonderful translation. It's going to be moving back and forward. And there are muscles that attach that to those processes, those sticky out parts on your vertebrae. And so
Dr. Wilczak and I are both sitting here with our arms, just moving them back towards our chest with the elbows towards our chest and then back towards our back, trying to feel this connection.
Yeah,
I encourage you to do that too.
Like connection. But if we come back to, and I'm going to say that this is very specific cases. I think one of the recent ones that's been done that's a really interesting one where Sebastian Violette and some of his colleagues had looked at Neolithic and Mesolithic remains in Europe, and then also compared them and looked at historical and modern samples. And what they found is on your humerus,
which is your upper arm bone.
Thank you. There are two little bumpy things we call epicondyles on either side, and you can feel them at your elbow.
At the bottom, exactly. You got this.
Yes, exactly. And so there's one on one side that's going to be on your pinky side, and we call that the medial one. And then there's one on the other side, your thumb side, that's the lateral. And so what they did is they were able to show that the medial side, your pinky side, in the Mesolithic and Neolithic males only showed that they would get where there's muscles that are attaching there, and they showed it's called epicondylosis, or it's going to be when you have strain to the tendon where it's attaching there, and it can cause inflammation and other changes because of that. And so they were able to see that there were changes there at that attachment site, and they associated it with spear throwing. And why? Because athletes, laborers, most of the time you get it on the other side. That's the most frequent, and that's what they found in the historical samples and the modern samples. But in those Paleolithic and Neolithic samples, it was on the side you don't usually see it. And in modern samples, you see that in javelin throwers in very specific cases.
That is so
You also see it in baseball players, pitchers.
And this gets back to that concept you were talking about earlier, where you can have a lot of different forms of activity that we would recognize as different, baseball throwing versus spear hunting.
Yeah.
But they have the same effect on the body.
Yes, exactly. And what's really brilliant about that, because I mentioned, well, there's so many activities and then you have all the different changes that can happen. What's really great about this study is when you see something that's a very unusual pattern. To me, that's where you might actually be able to say something. Because if you look at the literature that's been, and there's hundreds of articles, and it's like, oh, they had very large biceps and a lot of changes on the bicep. And I'm like, yeah, that happens a lot. Because even if, we're going to attribute a small part of it to activity, then,
you better be sure.
There's just so many different activities and so many things. Not to mention the fact that when tests have been done about whether we can extract a component in the changes we see at the muscle attachments using samples of known occupation. So these are historic samples that primarily come from the late 19th into the early 20th century, and you have documentation. There have been lots and lots of studies that were done that haven't been able to find a connection. If you look at manual laborers, heavy laborers, versus those that are doing like non-manual tasks, clerks versus bricklayers or ditch diggers. So that kind of data was coming out in the 2000s and up until the present, and it got people really down, and they're saying we can't extract this data, we're not seeing differences when I compare different muscle attachments between these two groups. And that's because we've got the age problems, we've got the disease problems, and all these other factors.
And then sometimes you have some things that can be kind of all three at once, right? It can be activity related, age related, and disease, right? So osteoarthritis is a great example of that.
That's the same problem with trying to use osteoarthritis as a marker, is you've got so many different
Although
factors.
I think that one of the things that is really interesting about historical bioarchaeology is you really do see an entirely different way of life. Like you see these women in their 30s with osteoarthritis, severe osteoarthritis in their back. That's something you don't really see too often these days, I imagine, in modern populations.
That's another example where a change in the pattern that you see normally with aging, perhaps that's where we may see something unusual. It might tell us something. So if you look at the vertebral body, you can get osteoarthritis at the joints on your back, right? Where the vertebrae come together.
And this is a good point. A lot of people don't realize that your vertebrae are all joints.
Yes, they're all joints, and they've got to do all kinds of things. They got to flex, they've got to rotate, depending on what you're doing. And so you've got on the back joints, and then you've got on the front. And you can also get bone formation as the discs between them break down. And sometimes you get bone formation on the front, on the body of those. And normally, we're bipedal. And because we're bipedal, we actually put a lot of stress on our back. And so it's kind of normal for the aging process to see bone formation on both the front and the back. And normally it's going to be most severe in the lower back, in the lumbar region, right? But when sometimes you'll see a change in the pattern where it's more frequent in the upper cervical neck vertebrae. And I did some work on the African burial ground, doing some analysis of data there. For those of you who don't know, this is a 17th century burial ground that had been kind of lost to history. And it is mostly African populations, slave population, freemen. So it's a mixed sample. But that pattern was true, where you saw that cervical vertebrae had those little spicules of bone on the front of the vertebrae more frequently than in the lower
And that
back.
can cause a lot of pain too.
It can cause pain.
And what were your conclusions from that?
The thought is that something like that indicates they may be doing something like carrying heavy loads on the head or on the back, because that's going to cause stress, compression stress especially. So yeah, change in the pattern. Or on that same site at the African burial ground, you also saw that you were seeing changes at the entheses, which happened very young. And also, by the way, with the osteoarthritis. So when you start to see the changes happening really young, like from 15 to 24 age group, lots of changes that young tells you something, because it's not normal. They change with age, but these are really young individuals. So.
Right. So that's indicating that potentially they were working very, very hard physically at younger ages.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that it was
just a lot of wear and tear.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what I mean by that. It's not, the thought was we could go out to any site and look at it. And all you have to do is do these markers. And sometimes we have to accept that at some sites there might not be the sample or conditions or activities that are recognizable. So we have to deal with those limitations and not daydream about what we can say.
This is great. I think that was like a very wonderful summation of everything we just talked about.
Well, this is what you do. I mean, I've come back and forth between working on these problems because you do get a bit frustrated. And like I said, it was looking kind of bleak, and you had these little bright spots where people decided to analyze things just a little bit differently. And when they did that, and they would get some good results. And then you get a flood of papers that said, no, we're not seeing the same thing. And I'll give you an example. When you look at one thing at a time, so in this case, we're looking at one muscle attachment at a time, and I compare the biceps and where the deltoid muscle in your upper arm attaches to the humerus. And I can look and I would make these comparisons in these historical documented samples and say, well, there's no differences between the different occupational categories that I've used. But sometimes if you look at many things at once, and this requires a different type of statistic so that you can analyze them all together, then you can sometimes pick up the labor signal or the activity signal. And so there was some work done on historical Portuguese populations. And by doing that, by looking at them all at once and also doing a type of statistics where you didn't put them into categories beforehand. You didn't preconceive, say, these are the hard laborers and these had the light labor, because that's problematic too, because do you really know? You know, when it says clerk, what does that mean?
Right.
Was he just like filling out accounting, or
was he doing heavy inventory?
Exactly. And so when they did that, they let the data itself and the statistics and the analysis do the clustering for them, looking at all these things at the same time. What they were able to do is they were able to detect some differences between hard laborers, lighter labor, and then, interestingly enough, farmers that are also hard labor, but they did come out and cluster a little bit separately. So there's a bright spot, right?
Yeah, definitely. If you're interested in getting into anthropology, you need to know math if you want to have relevant conclusions on any kind of large scale. Like, it's fine to analyze an individual, but even then you need to understand the statistics that are telling you, oh, I measured this femur, so statistically this person is between 5'5" and 5'8". You still have to understand the statistics that let you understand that formula was valid. So do math early.
Thank you. I will make my students listen to you, because I do the same thing. And I actually teach one of the statistics class for our department. And, you know, I always have to do the sell on it. I'm like, you need to take these statistics. And besides that, they don't realize that also that can translate, if you don't become an academic anthropologist, statistical skills apply in so many areas. Data analysis, I mean, come on.
Absolutely. I am a professional editor for a financial media company. I use my statistics all the time.
There you go.
So you can get a job just in case.
Exactly. You can put it on your resume. Mm-hmm. But I want to make sure that there's one thing that we also get to with this idea, because I told you that there was some really exciting new stuff, like last 6 months.
Tell me about it.
New stuff. When we talk about things like, does activity affect something like what your attachments look like? Mm-hmm. One of the kind of most definitive forms of evidence you can have is going to be experimental evidence, right? We always think, do the experiment where you actually control the conditions. Mm-hmm. Now, you can't do that with archaeological populations.
No.
So we can't control the conditions in that way. So you think about animal models.
Right. And I'm just going to put in a note here. The reason we don't think about human models very often is because it's extremely difficult to do ethical experiments on humans.
Yeah. I mean, and you can look at things like athletes, and there's been evidence from athletes.
And you know what's fun is all those NASA studies, they have volunteers lie in a bed for like 3 months at a time to see how much of their body wastes away.
Yeah.
But they get paid pretty good for it.
But then I also want to look at their skeleton. And so there's some limit to how much I can look at it in the skeleton.
So animal models.
So animal models are really good because you can vary the conditions and control things a bit more. And you control diet because nutrition might affect it too, right?
Certainly.
So there'd been some preliminary experiments. One of the first ones was done with sheep. I think it was the first one, actually looking at, what does this muscle attachment look like? And this was done by Ann Zumwalt at Hopkins. And she had sheep and she put them on treadmills and gave them little backpacks, actually, some of them, to increase the forces. Put them on the treadmill. And you do this for a few months, and some of them you don't. And then, you take and look at their bones to see if you've seen changes. Are there changes in the size of the attachments, or are there changes in the topography, you might say, like how much bone is sticking out in the valleys and how rough it is. So she did a lot of good work on that and found nothing. And then, had other people followed, and, turkeys you might do, rats, of course, another model that gets done. And there's a lot of negative results coming out of that. And so it's like, the animal models aren't working. And you could say they're a lot different from humans.
Mm-hmm.
The form of their bone microscopically is actually different, and you can look at and see those differences and speciate by that. So you've got differences at that level. You've got the fact that, these experiments are only run for a few months versus lifetime activity.
Mm-hmm.
You got the fact that they're doing a treadmill. Is that really strenuous enough? So you got critiques. So you're going back and forth, the people who believe and the people who don't believe, right? So that fight's going on. And going back to the multivariate analysis, where instead of looking at them one at a time, you look at them simultaneously. This research group in Germany did several things. Number one, they had done some work on the hand bones and the attachments of the hand.
Mm-hmm.
And they did some multivariate analysis there, again with known occupation. And they were able to separate them into two categories. If you looked at all of the muscles simultaneously, in one category, it was power grip.
Okay.
That would be your bricklayers and, that sort of occupation.
Mm-hmm.
And one was more precision, and it had to do with the muscles that rotate your thumb around so that it can come in contact with your other fingers, particularly your index finger. And so they're separated. So in one group, there's precision muscles are more developed. In the other group, it's the power muscles. And so they had that data from humans, and then they got together with a group from Harvard that had been working with turkey models, where they put the turkey on the treadmill. And that's why turkeys
are ornery birds too. Like, they could have picked so many different birds.
But they're a good size.
I guess that's true.
They're easy to get.
Yeah, you can make them real heavy.
And birds sometimes get used as a model because they're bipedal.
Interesting. Although their bones are so different.
Their bones are much different.
Because they have to be, turkeys not so much. Turkeys can fly short distances, which a lot of people don't realize. I do, because they used to live in trees near my elementary school, and they'd swoop down and try and peck at you, which was horrifying when you were approximately their size. But because of the flight issue, a lot of times bird bones are very, very different than human bones. They have to be light in order to be aloft.
Yes, exactly. So there's differences there, but, in theory, we're thinking there's differences in bones in non-human animals also react under the same principles. We'll see. No good results. And in fact, the group at Harvard had done the turkey studies, and they had them on treadmills. Mm-hmm. I didn't ask how you get a turkey to run on a treadmill, so. But some of them were inclined treadmills, and some of them were declined treadmills. So they're walking uphill or they're walking downhill. And they did the analysis looking at one muscle attachment at a time.
Mm-hmm. Nothing.
Well, they get together with the group in Germany and they look at the bones again. What they were looking at was slightly different, how they quantified changes. But most importantly was the fact that they looked at 3 muscle attachments together. Mm-hmm. And when they did that, and this paper has just come out, within the last 2 months. When they did that, what they found is you could distinguish the controls from the treadmill runners. And not only that, there were some differences, not as distinctive, between the decline and the uphill.
That's crazy. Multivariate analysis. That's amazing.
Yes. It's where it's at. Because when you think about what it is when you think about a small effect, so if we're talking about a small effect, if you look at one thing, it's hard to find that small effect with all these other factors that are also making these changes. Mm-hmm. But if you look at small effects, it's like adding them up together by looking at them all at the same time.
Right. And nothing in the body happens as a vacuum. Everything works in a system.
Absolutely.
I have the benefit of them having done all the work. I'm like, of course, this is the way to do it.
I know. Well, it's also a limitation of your method, right? Because it's only recently that you had low-cost scanning applications where you can scan the surface of the bone, put it into a program, and then you have some algorithms so you can extract the data and determine things like surface areas and
does all the math for you.
Yeah, exactly. And so you can do that now. You couldn't do that before. And when you're dependent on things like, okay, I'm going to look at this bone formation and I'm going to say whether it's small, medium, or large. I'm going to put it into categories. The type of statistics you can do, it's much harder to statistically work with that data. It can be done, but it's more difficult.
You also have inter-observer variation, right? So maybe you look at a bone attachment and you're like, wow, that's pretty rugged. I'm going to say big change. And I look at it and I'm like, maybe medium.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can try to define that like, oh, it's 1 millimeter or more, but it is problematic. And in fact, some of the earlier studies that were done, J. Lawrence Angel, he worked at the Smithsonian, right? So he had done some work at a Catoctin furnace in Maryland. So this is an ironworks, and you did have slave population working there. And he looked at the skeletal samples, and your lower arm, there's one bone that's called the ulna. And there's a little crest of bone that comes off the ulna, and it's called supinator crest. Mm-hmm. And supinator crests are going to when you rotate. So I've got my arm extended and I'm rotating my hand.
So imagine it as you want to hold a bowl of soup in the palm of your hand.
Beautiful.
That's why it's called the supinator. I used to teach anatomy.
I've got it. I didn't know that one. I have to use that with my students.
So if you want to take that bowl of soup that your hand is cradling and dump it out, you're using your supinator.
Yes. So anyway, well, I was talking about something totally different, but anyways, he equated this with them doing things that required supinating with force, things like using an axe when they had to make the charcoal, or when you had to, kind of poke at the fire and you have a long iron and you
got to twist it.
Twist it, yeah. But what he was using was like plus,
right,
plus. Mm-hmm. So this one looks small to me. This one looks big to me. This one looks medium to me. And how they look is going to vary too, depending on the population you're looking at.
Right. And when you say population, you're talking about...
Yeah, when I say population, for me, doing bioarchaeology, I'm thinking about it as an archaeological population. Mm-hmm. And so there's kind of differences as you go from population to population. Like if you go in the Southwest, archaeological populations, both historical and prehistorical, tend to be very gracile, we call them. Mm-hmm. So they have thinner bones, they're smaller skeletons, they're not as robust with as big attachments. So that's another variation, the genetic part, that you got to think about too.
Right. So like, is this rugged for rugose? Is actually the word that we use, but it just seems a little silly to say. Is it rugged for a for this particular population, or is it rugged overall?
Right.
You have to think about that.
Exactly. And so that's when you're doing it that way, if you can quantify it, then you can see if there are effects of the body size and take them out, basically, just statistically take them out.
Statistics are so much fun. That's the message you should get from this podcast.
Yes.
Sometimes you hate them, but most of the time they're good.
And there's all the statistical modeling software these days. Sometimes I look at some of the old studies done in like the 20s and I'm like, God bless those grad students who sat down and did all that math by hand. You don't have to do that anymore.
Well, I'm grateful because you can get more from the data, but also it made things a little bit simpler.
That's true.
If you look at some of those, dissertations from, before 1960, you had to do it by hand. So there's only so much data you can handle that way.
Oh, yeah,
They're much
certainly.
shorter. And the literature reviews aren't as big because there wasn't as much.
Yeah, certainly.
Oh, God. I can't imagine having to do it. That being said, it is very important to understand the underlying mathematics behind whatever statistical test you're using. So you should know how to do it by hand. You just don't have to do it by hand with 200 data points anymore.
Exactly.
Sorry, I feel like I'm being very preachy. I'm sorry to your students who are listening to this.
No, my students need this because if I tell them, they won't believe me. If you tell them.
It's true. It helped me get a job. Not in anthropology, but it helped me get a job.
Right.
Okay. I feel like we're kind of reaching a good stopping point, but is there anything else you want to say about occupational markers or about anthropology in general?
I think maybe two things on both, and anthropology in general, just because we've talked about students and who might be interested in anthropology, I have to say that it is going to give you, as a field, the broadest education you possibly can get. Because we're talking about humans in all their aspects, from the biological to the cultural and cultural differences and behavior. And, archaeology is connected. We talk about non-human primates and evolution. And so all of you students out there know about the general education requirements of some sort that the university makes you take. In my department, we also have visual anthropology, which deals with filmmaking, photography, and art. So we cover general education. We cover the arts, the humanities, the biological sciences, and the social sciences. And I don't know if there's any other departments that can do that.
And not only that, there's probably a mathematics course in your department. And a lot of anthropologists, especially bioarchaeologists, they have to understand something of physical sciences and chemistry because they have to understand the strata in which the skeletons are found. There's so much. It's really an incredible field. And I think if you're intellectually curious, it's the perfect place to be.
Exactly. And it translates into careers because of that, as you know. I always tell my students, when you're thinking about your career and when you need to go out and get a job, you're not going to be going to the paper and looking for anthropologist advertisements.
Right. They probably won't look at the paper anyway. They're probably going to go online.
Oh, I forgot. I'm very old. It's been a long time since. All right. Yeah, they have those websites and stuff wherever you go. But anyways, you have to also educate your employer on what you can bring to the table.
That's very true.
And so we have people who go into, the healthcare field as health advocates and, different sorts of nonprofits, because you've learned about things like ethnography, you've learned about social justice, you've learned medical anthropology and how do people navigate the medical system. You learn about, structural violence and structural racism. And so things like HR, people go into, in tech for user interface sorts of things.
Certainly.
They're doing that. So you can get,
And you learn all these skills doing research and writing.
Yes.
That are very important that a lot of people lack. something that I see sometimes when I'm trying to hire.
And we do emphasize in my department, I mean, I think our anthropology students are among the best writers. Well, the English department probably. Because we make them do a lot of writing, and we try to have classes where they're getting the basic foundation for how do you do research. I mean, they're going out and doing ethnographies with different populations around the city. Mm-hmm. We've got faculty that are working on ethnographies dealing with student homelessness and food insecurity, so that it's like really relevant.
I feel like this is
what they do.
Slowly turned into an ad for San Francisco State University.
That was my nefarious plan.
Well, it's working. I'm going to quit my job.
Come on down.
I'm going to go back to grad school.
We got a master's program too.
I already have my MA. If I go back, I have to get my PhD.
MA. Oh, it's an anthropology MA. Oh.
Yeah. Yes. My master's is in anthropology.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, thank you so much. It is now time for what many call the hardest part of the interview, where I ask you the same 3 questions that I ask everyone at the end of the interview.
Okay.
The first one is, if someone wanted to learn more about what you do, what would be a good place for them to start? Like, what should they read maybe? Is there like a book or an article where they can learn more about occupational stress markers or anthropology in general? What would you recommend?
What would I recommend? I think it really depends on your level of understanding, like where you are. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of, some of the just general science magazines, Natural History or the Smithsonian, that will have articles about it if you're just getting into it. If you are an undergraduate who maybe has a little bit more background or experience for just bioarchaeology in general, I would recommend there's a journal called the International Journal of Osteoarchaeology, and it has, articles on stuff I've published there, and it's got a broad range. So that would be a good place to start, just to see what types of research get done in the field.
That's a great recommendation. And then what are you reading for work right now?
Those papers that I just mentioned.
Perfect. I'll post links to them on the website. And this is something
I can send you those links.
Okay. And then the final question, mm-hmm. What are you consuming for fun right now? I used to ask, what are you reading for fun? But someone told me I don't read for fun anymore. So it can be a podcast. It could be a movie, TV series. It could be a book.
I just read there's a new David Sedaris book. I just finished it. Yeah, it was my Muni, for like the last week. That was my Muni book.
What's it called?
Oh, no, don't put me on the spot.
That's why everyone says this is the hardest part.
It's over there. It's the new David Sedaris. I don't know. Google it.
I'll look it up and I'll put it on the website. Do you recommend it?
Absolutely. I love him. I laugh, well, except for when you're on the Muni train, because I start laughing and people are looking at me.
Maybe that gets you a little bit more space on the Muni, though. They're like, I don't want to sit next to that lady. She's having too much fun on public transit.
That's right.
All right. Well, then, thank you so much for joining us here today. And hopefully you'll come back on the show sometime.
Yeah, it was wonderful. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. If you have questions or comments, you can reach me at gabby.lapera@anthrobiology.com. That's spelled GABY.LAPERA@anthrobiology.com. This show was produced and edited by me. Music courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear at Sound of Picture.